Okay, well, Clea asked me last week to fill in for the class today, and it's been a while since I've done this, probably, I don't know, over a year or so, and I think kind of what I was doing when I was filling in, either Wednesday or Sundays, was kind of going over parables. Well, the OABS lectureship kind of shot that right in the foot, so they covered all of those, and they did a good job covering them, so I thought, well, I better not do that again. So, um, and then when you have a lesson where you're just filling in, it's kind of tough because you don't know how long it's going to take. I mean, if you're up here, if you're preaching, you get up there and you basically, however long it takes is how long it takes. So we got to fill in a certain amount of time. So, and if we get done early, then I guess we get done early, and I'll give you guys some time back. But so when looking at a subject to cover for this, got to thinking and thought, well, I do have something picked out. It was something that I kind of, we went down to Oklahoma last fall, and there was a guy that had, I can't remember if it was his class or his actual lesson that covered this subject, and I thought, well, I'll kind of take on that and expand on it. So I guess we'll start out with a riddle. First of all, I fly without wings, I run without legs, and can't be stopped. What am I? Fly without wings, run without legs, and I can't be stopped. Time, exactly. That's what it is. The first time that obviously, time is something that is everybody relies on it, right? I mean, you can't really even go. We can't go through a week without, well, once you get retired, it's kind of hard to figure out which day it is. But sometimes, you can't really go throughout a week. Is this a day I'm going to work? Is this a day I'm going to be off? So time has something that has basically influenced every day that we live, every year that we live, and we'll go back. Let's turn to Psalms 90 and verse 10 through 12, and we'll kind of see what Moses has to say about time. Psalms 90 verses 10 through 12 says, "And the days of our years are 80 years and 10. If by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Who knoweth the power of thine anger? Even according to the fierce, so is wrath. So teach us the number of our days, so that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." Well, what is that? What does those verses mean to you? Use your time wisely, right? And we kind of go, if we kind of go back and look at the first part of Psalms 90, let's read from 1 down through 6, I believe. Moses writes, "Lord, thou hast been dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever there hath been formed the earth and the world, even from the everlasting to everlasting, thou art God. Thou turnest man into destruction, and sayest, Return, ye children of men. For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it was past, and as a watch in the night. Thou carriest away them as with flood. Thou art as asleep in the morning, and the grass which thou groweth up in the morning flourisheth and groweth up, in the evening is cut and withered away. So what is he trying to contrast there? From what we read in verses 10 through 12 as to what we read in the first 6 verses here. What basically he's talking about, hey, here's, we're contrasting the time that we have on this earth, that we have allotted to ourselves, as to compared to what? Those that God has been around, right? I mean, I've heard people try to, make comparisons for everlasting life, and I've heard it said, well, you can take an ant and put a string between the earth and the moon, and have an ant take all the sand, on all the beaches, and that wouldn't even be a second. So, we can't even really fathom what it is for God to have been around, basically been forever, right? He was never have a beginning, and he'll never have an end. So, but we obviously, especially on this earth, have at least a beginning. Hopefully that, we will live eternally and we won't have an end, but, those things are, we have dates on, right? It's kind of funny that Moses would say this, because, how long do we know that Moses lived? Does anybody have an idea how long Moses lived? He is said to, if we what the Bible references, is that he lived 120 years. So why would that be that, he talks about living 70 years and 80 if we're in good health, and yet he lived to be 120 years old? What do you think? Why do you think that would be? Anybody have any guesses? My opinion is God had a purpose for him, right? What was Moses' purpose? To get the Israelites out of Egypt and into the Promised Land, right? And apparently, that took a little longer than what God had initially set it up for us, because there were those who didn't believe that they could do it, right? So they spent 40 years basically wandering in the wilderness, and God, laid out his purpose, and it was not until that was over with that Moses had died. And you see several other things, references to people's age and everything in the Bible. How long did Adam live? Anybody have any ideas how long Adam lived? He lived about 930 years. How long did Seth live? Anybody have any idea how long Seth lived? 912, right. How long did Methuselah live? 969, right? All of those, it seems that, those lifespans back in what we would call the Old Testament times, at least the early part of the Old Testament times, probably at least pre-flood, those folks lived about 13 times as what our lifespan would be. And why do you think that would be? Anybody have any guesses as to why that would be? Okay, we need to populate the earth. There's a couple of theories as to physically why that has happened. One is that the pre-flood, and it really, people still, even shortly after the flood, lived a long time. Hundreds of years instead of 70 or 80. But there's a couple of theories that kind of point to that. And one is that the earth was a different place before the flood, right? It was before that. It said that there was a filament in the earth that basically did a lot of things. One thing it did was it kept a lot of the radiation from coming down. And if you ever are out in the sun very long, you'll see spots on your arm and stuff like that. That basically is a cause of radiation. That didn't happen back pre-flood days. Another thing that didn't happen, another thing that was beneficial was the oxygen levels in the atmosphere were probably somewhere Today, does everybody know what the oxygen level today in the atmosphere is? It's about 21%. You know what the oxygen level is, and they've actually found, everybody, if you've seen the Jurassic Park movies, everybody talks about the thing that basically they found a bubble there that had a bug in it that they used to generate these dinosaurs. Well, that actually did happen with there were basically oxygen bubbles in those embers that they were able to pull out, and they found that the oxygen levels back pre-flood were about 35%, so about 50% higher than they are now. Can you imagine? We kind of if you go up in the mountains, you start struggling for air, don't you? You go up, if you were in a plane and you weren't in a, it wasn't, didn't have oxygen pumped in there, you'd have trouble breathing. So, the fact that they had, those things, those environmental things probably led to the fact that they live longer than we do. What are some of the other things? I think God had a hand in this. What are some of the other things that would lead to the fact that people in the Old Testament times, live longer? Anybody have any guesses or any comments on that?
So I read, I don't know how true this is, but so take it with a grain of salt. But I read that it didn't rain before the flood. It was just like a mist and humidity thing that hydrated the earth.
Right.
And if you look at, I don't know if you've ever been to like Jamaica or Hawaii or like the tropical islands where the humidity level is just really high all the time. A lot of the local people um, look a lot younger than they are.
Mm-hmm.
So I know in Jamaica we met some older ladies that were in their 90s and one or two even in their hundreds, and they looked like they were probably 70 years old. And so I assume that the higher humidity and higher hydration in their skin and just in their daily lives probably helped with living longer and specifically their skin.
Yeah, I think that's a part of it. I think that's, and the other thing that's talked about, I don't know, the degeneration of man. Mankind, God made Adam perfect, right? He was a perfect being, as far as, what he made there was, the perfect man. And as we go on with time, we get diseases, we get different things that happen, heart disease, stuff like that, starts bringing the lifespan of man down further and further. And again, the one thing that I kind of point to that, I think God had a plan for that was because, the Old Testament times spanned between, 3,000 to 4,000 years, right? And the Old Testament goes over that, that many years. How hard would it be if your generations were only 70 years to keep track and to get that written down as a point of history if the generations were only 70 years? You think about Adam again living, the flood probably happened, the flood happened somewhere around what time? From the beginning of time, how long was it until the flood happened? Let's see, I have this in my notes here. My notes are all over the place. But it happened around 1,650 years after creation. So, you think about it, Adam almost, lived within, a few hundred years of seeing the flood, right? So obviously, a couple of generations, the flood happened, right? So, it was a lot easier to document what had happened in those first 4,000 years with man living so long, right? Again, New Testament times, you're documenting what? Maybe less than 100 years. You're probably, from the time that Christ was born until, until the last writings of the New Testament was probably, what, less than 70 years, right? So those, that period of time is covered in the New Testament, and, it's a very short amount of time compared to what the Old Testament times were, right? And we, again, after, we've lived from the Old Testament, or from the time the flood happened, we've lived about 4,400 years after the flood had happened. So, again, that has a lot to do with, the amount, or the lifespans that we all live. What's the average lifespan of a man today? What's that? 73.8. So about 74 years is how long, and this is worldwide. So, I mean, obviously you got countries where that brings the average down, and countries that, that'll live longer than that. And again, we talked about how long Moses lived. He lived about 120 years. How long did Joshua live? Anybody have any idea how long Joshua lived? He lived to be about 110 years old. So, again, you can kind of see, things are trending towards the fact that, our lifespan that Moses had pointed out of 70 years and, 80 if you're kind of lucky, I guess, is basically trending out, right? Let's look at some other things in Psalms. David, look at Psalms 39, verses 4 and 5. Psalms 39, verses 4 and 5. We have the Psalm of David. It says, Lord, make me to know mine end and measure of my days, what it is, and that I may know how frail I am. Behold, thou hast made my days as a handbreadth, and my age is of nothing before thee. Verily, every man at his best state is altogether vanity. So, how long did David live? Does anybody remember how long David lived? He was that average of 70 years. He lived 70 years. About 30 before he reigned, and then about 40 years he reigned as a king. But again, David realizes, hey, you know what? I have, my life is but a vapor, or very short, right? And Christ also had some lessons on the fragility of life. Let's turn over to Luke chapter 12. And look at starting at verse 16. And it says, And he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, because I have no room? Where shall I bestow my fruits? And he said this will I do. I will pull down my barns, and there I will bestow all my fruits and my goods. And he said unto my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee, and then shall those things be which thou hast provided. So is he layeth up the treasure for himself, and is not rich toward God. So, what does God have to say about, your years? Are you promised those 70 years? We're not promised anything, are we? We're basically, what Moses was saying is, hey, you know what, you may have 70 good years, 80 if you are lucky, but, you're not promised anything. And, Jesus basically says that, hey, you know what, these things that you think you have, they're given to you. They're not promised to you, right? Let's change over. I'll change over or turn over to Job. And see, Job was a man that, more than anybody else, dealt with a lot of things in his life, didn't he? Look over to Job 7, verses 6 through 7. And Job says, "My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and are spent without hope. Oh, remember that my life is wind, mine eye shall no more see good." So what is, and then I'll also turn over to Job 9, verses 26, or 25 and 26. It says, "Now my days are swifter than a post that flee away, they see no good. They have passed away as swift as ships, as an eagle that hasteneth to his prey." And what is Job saying there? He's saying the same thing. Hey, you know what? These, your days are swift and they're numbered, right? You're not guaranteed to have another day of breath. And and again, it's like Job is obviously someone who would have a very good reasoning for that, because he dealt with a lot of things, didn't he? If you think, well, you know what? If you have good times, they go fast. Bad times, they take longer. Well, Job had both, right? He had very good times, he had very bad times, and he said, it didn't matter. Those things were swift, and he realized the fact that they weren't. Time goes fast. Let's turn over to James 4, verses 13 through 15. James 4, verses 13 through 15. And it says, "Now go to now that ye that say today or tomorrow I will go into such a city and continue there a year, and buy and sell and get gain. Whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is in your life? It is even as a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanish away. For what you ought to say is, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that." The author here is basically saying, your life is like a vapor, and everybody's seen steam on a oven or something like that. It's up there and then all of a sudden it's gone, or something rising off a pond early in the morning when it's cold outside and the temperature's warm. What is that? Is that, that's not anything at all, is it? Basically, we realize, and this is what the author's saying, those things are basically nothing, right? So, we see all this about, about the brevity of life and all those things, but, why is that important to us? What makes the fact that we realize that important as a Christian anyway?
Helps keep things in perspective.
Yeah, helps you keep things in perspective. What else? Yeah, I don't know any of you guys that went to college. What happens when the very first day of school or the very first day of class, they'll tell you, here's what we're going to do this semester, blah, 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 blah. And then usually at the very end they say, there's a term paper due that's at the very end. When do you think most of those term papers get done? You've got, 13 weeks to do that. When do you think most of those term papers get done? The night before, exactly. And why is that?
People have a lack of sense of urgency, and they don't know how to keep things in perspective.
Yeah, people think, look how long a time I've got to get that done. And, it makes it easier to put it off. And then all of a sudden, the only thing that gets you to do it is, hey, if I don't turn this in tomorrow, I'm going to get an F, So that's your sense of urgency is, again, you've put it off until the very end, and that's kind of human nature, unfortunately. And the same thing can be said with us. There's, I see people all the time, and I've studied with people that have told me, hey, you know what? I know what I need to do to obey the gospel, and I'm going to put it off. Because why? Why do they say that? I heard someone personally told me this that I was studying with, that his reasoning for not obeying the gospel was, hey, I'm having too much fun. I'll obey the gospel at some time, and to my knowledge, he's never obeyed the gospel. So, that's kind of human nature, isn't it? We put things off till the end, and then all of a sudden we don't know when that end is, do we? I mean, because you have no idea. God could come again tomorrow, or you could, you hate to see it, but every holiday weekend, how many times do you see so and so? How many people died in a car crash? Those things happen all the time, and we have no idea how much longer we've got to live on this life. So that's obviously important to a Christian, is to know, what, I need to make my life on this earth worthwhile. And and you think about it, why are those people are saying, well, you know what, I don't want to do this because I don't want to have it cramp my style basically until I'm old. We can't do anything else, and that's kind of the reasoning, right? First of all, the chance of them doing that is probably zero, because why? They don't have the right attitude in the first place, do they? It's very selfish to think, you know what, I'm going to do for me until the very last second, until I, you hear about these people that are, supposedly deathbed confessions or whatever. That is a very selfish way to think. If you're thinking, well, you know what, I don't want to do anything until the very last minute. First of all, it's not a Christian attitude, right? You should have, as a Christian, you should have the attitude, hey, you know what, I want to get to heaven, I want to get as many people to heaven as I can. Jake?
I try to think of, life on earth as our resume for heaven. And you try to get any job, if you've got, 6 months of experience and you're trying to, apply for a career path job, you're most likely not going to get hired. And I just try to think about that in conjunction with, waiting your whole life to obey the gospel until you're like, on your deathbed. If God's looking at your resume and he sees, he's looking for servants. He's not looking for somebody to check the boxes, just in time.
Mm-hmm.
So I just kind of wonder sometimes, if that's even a legitimate way to gain salvation, if that's even going to work, for a lack of better terms. You know what I mean? I mean, it ultimately is between them and God. But I just wonder, like, I don't think that I could have confidence in my salvation if I waited. Just knowing what God is looking for and what he expects of us.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see those expectations being met by someone who's done no work in the kingdom. No work on earth, and then just obeyed last minute because they thought they were about to die.
Yeah. Well, I've been to a lot of funerals where basically, you hear the guy get up there and talk about how, well, this happened, as he was, when his last day or two. You know what? I mean, I'm thinking, there's a lot of reaching going on there, right? There's a lot of people that are just saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to reason myself into the fact that this person did not go to hell. He went to heaven. Russ?
We think about time and God's knowledge. In Acts 24 with Felix, the Bible reveals that God knew that Felix was afraid. It says he was afraid and trembled, which is why he didn't obey. And so whenever we put off obeying the gospel or doing something else for was the reasoning behind it. And so, you know, we don't fool God. He knows when we obey the gospel, he knows the sincerity of it with the lack thereof. As you pointed out, everybody's just saying at a funeral.
Yeah, yeah. And like I say, I've seen a lot of people. Go ahead,
I
Kyle.
don't want to cut you off.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think part of the reason why it's so difficult is for people would be so difficult because if you take that long, then it's all the friends that you probably have, right? So it's not just that people don't typically work like I'm an individual and I'm going to make decisions because I see fit. They typically make decisions based on a herd mentality. And so if you're not an exceptional person and and this is just to say that you're a typical person that follows the herd, it's going to be very difficult for you to have the strength to, stop meeting the expectations of all your friends and decide to actually be a Christian, and then you have to tell everybody that you knew, and then maybe positions that you've gotten because you were more worldly to people.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to, you have to be able to have the kind of strength at that age to put all that away, and it's probably not possible.
Yeah. You know, I mean, the parable that Jesus taught about, the laborers who came at different times of the day, obviously says, hey, you know what? There's no age restriction that says you can't become a Christian, in the 11th hour or whatever. But, again, I think the attitude of someone who comes into it and says, you know what? I'm going to put it off as long as it wasn't, the attitude of those laborers wasn't the fact that, hey, I'm going to put it off and I'm going to go, instead of coming in at the 8th hour, I'm going to go into the 11th hour. That was not their attitude. Their attitude was, hey, they didn't get it presented. The opportunity wasn't presented to them until that time, right? So, for someone to say, hey, you know what, it doesn't matter whenever you obey, if you know what you should be doing and put it off, that's a problem, right? That's an issue.
I think the key word there is obey. Is what you're saying. Is if you're actually obeying, then you're obeying the gospel at the time that you learned of it, rather than checking the box. And so, kind of like what Russ was saying earlier, where God knows our hearts, and He knows our reasoning behind everything, and I am looking from Him. So I think there's, obviously there's situations where someone may have gone their whole life and never really been taught the gospel, and they're in the hospital, and a nurse comes in and she's a Christian, or he's a Christian, and teaches them the gospel. I think if that person obeys at that point, that is completely legitimate, and I think if God knows their heart, that's going to be a legitimate salvation. But yeah, anyway, so I was just saying that there's obviously there's cases where it's like that 11th hour. That person wasn't just putting it off and waiting to have fun, live their life. They legitimately didn't know, or hadn't been taught until that time.
Right. And it was like what Kyle was saying, that, it's hard because you get to where, your friends, your family, people all around you are not in the right position. And, just to admit to the fact, hey, you know what, when we see, we see in the Bible example, the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man, he was not one of these that, was going to say, hey, you know what, I care about, what I care about my family. Go back and tell them, don't do that. They didn't have that attitude. You know what? If it wasn't good enough for my parents, it wasn't good enough for my friends, then it's not good enough for me. He realized that and said, hey, send them back and try to get them on the right path, right? So like I say, we as Christians, should take that same attitude. You know what? My ancestors have been Catholics for all these many years, and so I'm going to keep doing that. Or my ancestors have been, whatever, Baptist or Mormon or whatever. You can't use that as an excuse, because it's not going to be. There's not going to, it's not going to be a good excuse whenever the day comes, right? And like I say, the rich man tried to, point that out. Hey, if you can, go back and tell them that they're wrong, because, that's not, the fact that, just, be like me is not a good thing to do in that case. Anything else on that?
So, I mean, I think the biggest thing about that is he was stony-hearted, I guess, whenever he saw, Lazarus at his gate, he didn't acknowledge him, right? And so I guess that's the biggest thing, for people today, to take away from that example is, it's just the state of your heart, right? And if you pass, and the state of your heart is callous against people, then it probably fits the story description of rich man.
Right. Some other thing, to think of as Christians, if you, let's go back to Jeremiah 8 verses 20. It says, the harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. So again, there's a time, there's a time for doing that, and, there's a time when it's past, and when it's past, it's past. You can't say, there's not this, you hear all these people that say, well, once the judgment comes in, Christ is going to come back down and give those a second chance. There is no second chance, right? There is one chance, and we've all got it. Again, time, the one thing that everybody has got equally is time, right? And you can do with it what you want. You can waste it, or you can use it wisely, and it just depends on what you want to do with it. Let's turn over to Luke 14. There's another parable that Jesus taught. Luke 14, starting in verse 16. Luke 14, starting verse 16, we'll read down to 24. It says, and he said unto him, a certain man made a great supper and bade many. And he sent his servant at supper time to say to them that were bidden, come, for all things are ready. And they all with one consent began to make excuses. The first said unto him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must needs go and see it. I pray thee therefore, have me excused. Another one said, I have bought 5 yoken of oxen, and go to prove them. I pray that I have me excused. Another said to him, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So the servant came and showed his lord these things, and the master of the house, being angry, said unto his servant, go yet quickly into the streets and the lanes and the cities, and bring hither the poor, the maimed, and halt and the blind. And the servant said, Lord, this is done, and thou hast commanded, and yet there is room. And the Lord said unto them, unto the servant, go out into the highways and hedges, and compel them to come in, that my house be filled. For I say unto you that none of those men which were bidden shall taste of my supper. What is Jesus' parable there? What's he trying to get across to them? I think this is kind of specifically talking to the, basically the Jews, basically, right? The Jews, and they were the first given the opportunity to become Christians, right? And for the most part, what did they do? For the most part, they turned it down. They did not heed to the gospel. So, but for us today, again, we're going to be given. We're given an opportunity. Everyone in the world is given the opportunity to obey the gospel, right? And what do people do? We just talked about it before. What did each one of these people do? They made an excuse, right? And what is an excuse? What is an excuse really? You're just trying to reason with someone, right? You know what? This is why I don't want to do this, and this is what my excuse is. But, you know, did the master, did he say, okay, yeah, all right, I see your excuse. Maybe I'll come back again, you know, next time I have it at a supper. No, he said, you know, those people that did not, you know, that gave those excuses, you know, that's gone. You know, your opportunity's gone. And again, you know, we as Christians, that same thing. You know, our opportunity to obey the gospel is got a limited amount of time, right? It's limited to the amount of time that we're here on this earth. And you know, we've talked about it before, you know, but you know, that could be someone that's you know a teenager. You know, whenever they, you know, I'm not gonna put a date on that when that time is, but you know, at some point they realize that you know you've got the opportunity, and you've got, you know, you understand what's you know what the gospel is and what you how you need to obey it, and at that point the clock starts ticking, right? And you can't, you know, you can make up all the excuses you want, but at some point, if you don't, then those chances are going to go away. You know, what's another thing that we as Christians, you know, should take into account with those, you know, those days in our lives that are limited. You know, what's the number one job as a Christian besides us getting to heaven? Getting as many people as you can to join you, right? So, you know, again, we've got an opportunity every day to go out and say, hey, you know what? You know, do you know what the gospel is? You know, have you heard that? And if we don't take advantage of that, what are we doing? We're just like those at the, you know, that were at the asked to the feast. We're making excuses, right? And you know, we can make any excuse that we want, and yet it's not going to be, you know, on the day when we're said, hey, you know what? Did you help bring this person to Christ? You know, you knew this person was, you know, in a bad way. Did you take advantage of that? You know, we're either going to say yes or no, right? Turn over to Matthew 9 and verse 37. It says, I pray ye therefore the Lord of harvest that he will send forth laborers into his harvest. And what's he asking for there? Again, he's asking for people to do the bidding of what a Christian is, right? I'm not going to have time to go through all of this, but Matthew 25, starting verse 14. You know, we'll go back, and like I say, we just talked about the talents. The man who was traveling to a far country and basically gave talents to those. You know, the first two that he gave talents to, what did they do with them? They used them, right? They actually got more. The third one that he gave one talent to, what did he do? He buried it. You know, that's the same as us saying, you know what? I've got the opportunity. I'm going to bury it because, you know, again, what did he say? He was afraid, right? And sometimes we're afraid to talk to people, but it shouldn't be the fact that we're afraid that, you know, that we're doing something against God, because that's not the case. We are doing God's will if we do that. And like I say, if we use that as an excuse not to, then, you know, that's, again, what, you know, that's a mark against us, right? I think we're about done, so.